My name is Lee Fanwick. I'm here today on July 22nd interviewing Ellie Scher for the Jewish Historical Society Oral History. And with me is Bernie Levy, who's doing the video. Thank you, Ellie, for allowing us to do this with you.
You're more than welcome. I'm honored.
Okay. I looked at your questionnaire and there were some very interesting things which I'm going to...
Like what?
Well, like you tell me that you came to Norwalk, Connecticut first.
Uh-huh.
And here I thought you were born and bred in Stamford.
I'm sorry. You may sit on that chair if you'd like. I'm sorry if you were disillusioned. Actually, I was born in the Bronx, New York, up the street from the old Yankee Stadium.
Oh, that's an interesting place.
And I lived there until I was 7 years old. So, and then I came to Stamford after I got married.
Where did your parents come from?
My parents lived in New York.
But
My mother was born in this country.
Your father was?
My
Your
mother.
mother.
My father came when he was 4
Uh-huh.
to America.
He came with his parents.
He came with, my grandfather was a cantor rabbi, very well known on the east side of New York. First of all, he was his name was Jacob Raskin. He had 4 sons, one of whom was my father. And he was a cantor who had a magnificent voice. And it happened that all of his 4 sons inherited that voice. And before long, everybody on the east side knew that where you go for the high holy days is to Cantor Raskin's place, because you get a show of these 4 men, the sons and the father, with their beautiful voices. And we made a real trip every single holiday because we were way up in the Bronx, above the Grand Concourse, and they were way down on the Lower East Side. And it was over an hour on the subway.
Your father was a cantor in the Lower East Side?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather.
My father was an accountant who knew how to do a service because of his upbringing. And Norwalk didn't have a very large Jewish congregational, can't think of the word. Anyway, there weren't many Jews living in Norwalk when we did it. And sometimes every one of the congregations had a rabbi, and sometimes they didn't. And very often services were held at what was the JCC in Norwalk. And when they didn't have a rabbi, especially if it happened last minute, my father would get a call. Call his office and say, "Max, can you do the services this year?" He said yes.
Which congregation was this?
Well, there was only a...
Was that Temple Bethel?
No, my father founded that eventually, but it wasn't there when we got there. There was a Orthodox, to which we didn't belong, although my father did services there too if they needed him. And we belonged to, I don't know, it was kind of a free whatever. They didn't have a congregation of its own. Anybody who needed a place to go would show up at the Jewish Center. My father would be there with all the regalia. He owned all that stuff. And
So this was the forerunner of Temple Bethel?
well, different location. You know where Temple Bethel is. And the JCC in Norwalk was downtown, what we call downtown.
Where was that? Do you remember?
Oh, I remember very well, but I don't know if you would remember. You know East Avenue?
Yes.
Well, it wasn't there. It was the
That's
next,
the present Bethel.
the next section of Norwalk was downtown, where most of the shopping was. And that's
What
where,
would you call the downtown at that time?
I don't remember. If I knew you were gonna ask me that, I might have.
You're not talking about
Oh,
East
I
to
could
Stu
have asked
Leonard's, right?
Ruthie Wattenberg, she probably knows.
Right.
I knew Ruth Wattenberg growing up. She and my sister were very buddy-buddy. Best friends. Anyway, where were we? We wandered a bit.
Talking about the congregation.
Oh, so, I lived in Norwalk. After we moved
Did you go to
from,
high school in Norwalk?
I graduated from Norwalk High School, yes. And
What
when
brought your father to Norwalk?
again,
What brought your father to Norwalk?
I was just going to tell you that. My dad, I'm very happy to say, was an excellent accountant and had a very good reputation. And one person told another person. And who the first person was in Norwalk to know my dad and recommend him to a friend of his in Norwalk, and my father took the train and came in. I don't know who the initial person was. But my father, over a period of a couple of years, gathered such a big clientele in Norwalk that he was going back and forth and back and forth. And at one point he said to my mother, you know, this is ridiculous, I'm commuting. My biggest accounts now are in Norwalk. The kids would love to live in that town. It's a real New England town. At that time it was a small, typically New England town, much more New England in appearance and in general lifestyle than Stamford was already. When I came to Stamford, it was already like a cosmopolitan place. Little did I know it was going to become a piece of New York. But to me, God, you know, my life was Lower East Side for the holidays and the Grand Concourse. I was a little kid, where did I go? So when I came to Stamford, it seemed like a very big city to me because New York, which really was a big city, I didn't go to those parts. I just lived in my block. Anyway, so that's what brought us. He was here so much, here, I mean Norwalk, that it seemed the better part of wisdom, which it turned out to be. And he had a very lovely office in the downtown section of Norwalk, right where the railroad came and where what is now, you know, Norwalk now has that street of restaurants. Well, that's where his office was, upstairs, up above Liggett's. And I don't know if you know Abe Slavitt. If you did know Abe Slavitt,
No, I
he was
did not.
very well known. He had a lot of relatives in Stamford. And he shared an office in that building also. So that's how I got to Norwalk.
Where did you live in Norwalk?
We lived in a number of places. Our first house was it was a two-family house, and it was on, I have to warn you, this happens to me a lot now, where I know what I want to say, but it doesn't flow freely like it used to. East Avenue, and that's where Bethel is. We lived actually across the street from what became Bethel. So we lived there for a while, and then we moved to a private house off Betswood Road. And we lived there a number of years, and then we moved to Gregory Boulevard down by the beach. And that's where I spent the rest of my time in Norwalk until I got married and moved to Stamford. And the very first day of school was my birthday. First day of college was my 17th birthday. And one of the girls that I had met said, let's go down to the game room, the only place you could smoke at that time. I want to introduce you to some people. She said, I know somebody you might want to meet because he's from your area. I said, fine. So she said, Ellie Scher.
Which college was this?
This was Teachers College of Connecticut, which is now Connecticut State University. So we walked into the game room, kids were there, smoking, laughing, talking. And she said, oh, there he is. Ellie, this is Ellie Scher from Stamford. Al, this is Ellie Scher from Norwalk. That night I was out on a date with him. And that was the beginning of what?
Except you were Ellie Raskin.
I was Ellie Raskin and I became Ellie Scher 4 years later. Almost 3 years later, because he wanted to elope in our junior year. He said, this is it. He couldn't wait any longer. This was, he said, you're interfering with my studying, you're driving me crazy, I think we should elope. At first that sounded very glamorous. And I said, oh, wow. And he said, I've already looked up where we could get married in New Haven, and all I need is for you to say yes. Let's do it. First, it seemed so glamorous to me.
Weren't you underage?
Pardon?
Weren't you underage? I guess not.
By then I was 17 when I met him. I was, 19. I never thought about that. Anyway, the idea didn't last very long because the more I thought about it, the more I thought there is no way that I'm going to get married without my parents and my sister there. No way. So I said to him, we're going to have to wait. So we did become engaged that last summer. I went back to my senior year with the ring on the finger. And it was wartime, and lots of girls were coming back with the ring on the finger, and the guys were going off. And we graduated in May, and we got married in August. And I came to live in Stamford.
Where was the first place you lived in Stamford?
Oh, gee. I lived in a lot of places because you couldn't get a room to stay in. You couldn't get a place to live. The first place I lived was in my mother and father's apartment in Norwalk, and we commuted to Stamford every day because we were both employed at the old Clunan School on the other side of the railroad tracks. The building is actually still there. And we lived there for a while. And some friends of ours who also worked in Stamford used to pick us up. We'd meet them at where the bus stopped, and they'd pick us up and drive us into Stamford. And how did we get home? At the end of the day, we had no car. And even if we could have had a car and a place to keep it and all of that, there was no money for a car. There was no money for anything. We were probably the poorest bridal couple living in Stamford because he had put himself through school, which, you know, what you pay today for school and what we paid for that state school was so ridiculous, but to us it was a lot of money. he worked his way through and kept a little black book of every nickel he spent, literally every student Sunday that we had down at the campus store at the end of the campus, actually. I think it was something like, we shared one Sunday, I think it was something like 10 or 15 cents. And that was the big date on Friday night or Saturday night, if he wasn't working. He got a job in Hartford on Saturdays very soon after we got there, so Saturday night was not date night for us because he was working. But it was a very frugal time, but we were madly in love. I was very happy. And when I tell my daughter these stories about the student Sunday, she looks at me in utter amazement. She said, if a guy took me out for a date for a Sunday that I had to share with him, that'd be the last time I'd see him. She said, Mother, how did you go out? I said, Janet, that's what we did in those days. I said, do you think your father and I were the only ones having the Sunday and sharing it? The whole place was crowded with kids sharing a Sunday with whoever the current boyfriend was. I said, my current boyfriend happened to be the one, and we broke up once and I went out with some guy, Bill Thier, I remember, for a very short while. But Al was very persistent and he could wear you down. He nudged and he nudged and he nudged and he called and finally said, okay, you know.
Where was your first job?
My first job here in Sanford was the same place as his first job, which was the old Clunan. And we were hired with the understanding, and we had to sign a paper, that when the soldier that we were replacing returned home, hopefully that he would, we would be dismissed. But if we had done a good job, we would get a promise that the first job that opened in our field would be ours.
What did you teach? What was your first teacher?
I was teaching English and social studies.
And Al?
Al was teaching math, which he was a business major, but they didn't have business subjects at that time. So he was teaching math, and I taught English and social studies, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And Clunan was supposed to be the school that you prayed not to be assigned to.
Why was that?
Well, the discipline and the this and the that. The worst discipline was a kid chewing gum. That was really a misdemeanor of the highest order. These kids were so good. When I look back on it now, I wonder if there's a school anywhere in the United States where kids behave the way those kids did. Teachers had to be on hall duty between classes, near your room, outside your door actually. And the kids would come in and sit down and be talking quietly until you came in. You walked in that room, it was like you were in there alone. Anybody who was talking stopped. You greeted them, they greeted you, the class started, every face was looking at you, the books were open to the page that was written on the board. Of course, we had no computers, we had blackboards, you stood up the whole hour that you were teaching. I loved every minute of it. And the last thing I wanted to be was a teacher. This was one of those things when it was time for me to go to college. My father, whom I adored, if he had told me I had to go to live in a cave, I would have gone, yes, Daddy, dear. Anyway, he sat down and said, you know, Ellie, things are tough. There's no question that you're going to go to college. But the only thing that I can afford now is a state school. And my sister was going there already. Ruth Wattenberg, who lives right down the hall now, was going there. It was had a very good reputation in its day. And he said, start. I wanted to go to Wellesley. I had a teacher who told me that I should go to Wellesley. She had graduated from there, and she said, Ellie, that's where you belong. That school is perfect for you, and I want you to go home and discuss it with your parents. Well, that was a couple of years prior to when I was actually ready to go. But I said, you know, I understand what you're telling me, and I will start school. He said, you'll have 2 years under your belt. Be easier to get in somewhere else. He said, I know you'll do well. You always have. So that was how I got there. And as I say, the last thing I wanted to be was a teacher. I had very unusual ideas. I wanted to be an actress. I wanted to be a ballerina. I wanted to be a world-renowned author. That was what I was going to be. Any one of those things would have done to start. And I had always loved school, but I didn't see myself as a teacher. Well, as I told you, I met Al the very first day that we were there, and that changed my mind about a lot of things. And it turned out that I was very fortunate. I loved teaching. I wasn't a ballerina, and I wasn't an actress, but I did direct all the school plays in every school I was ever in, and that was my compensation for my acceptance of, I can't do that, but I'll do this. And one year, I had a 9th grade class that I remember when I announced to them that we were going to do a Shakespearean play, and they all fell off their chairs. Oh, we're going to hate it. Can't we do something? You know, I said, look, let's give it a shot. And if you hate it, we won't do another one. But let's try. It was a class that I really loved. They weren't the top group, but they were very well behaved, and they tried very, very hard. And I really loved them all. And some of them I still run into. And wherever I happen to be and they see me, they come over and talk to me. So anyway, we did Shakespeare, and I was in my glory because I acted all the parts. It was Julius Caesar, I remember. And when we finished, and they were very good. They really were very good. The day after we finished the play, they'd taken their final test and everything. I walked into my classroom. It was their period. And on the desk was a box tied with a ribbon. And the room got very, very still. And they were all looking at me. And they're looking at one another. And I went over to my desk and I said, oh, this looks like there's something fun in here. And they giggled, opened it up, and it was a little statuette. And on it said, World's Best Actress. I still have it somewhere here.
That was your Oscar.
That was my Oscar. And they said, first we wanted to get World's Best Teacher, but we couldn't find that. And we knew that you loved to act. So we found World's Best Actress, and one of the kids said, you know, she might even like that one better. And that was, oh, I came home from school that day. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to show Al what they had given me, and it was very exciting. So I was in the school business for 4 years. So I must have liked it. And I found it a very fulfilling career. I had 20 years in the classroom and 20 years as a guidance counselor. And I loved the whole thing, which is not to say there weren't some moments that were difficult, But I loved the kids, I loved working with the parents when I was counseling. And after retiring, after 40 years, I found I missed it a lot, and I used to go back a lot, and they used to call me and say, how would you like to do reading to kids during lunch hour, and how would you like to this or that and the other, and I always said yes. And so I visited for quite a few years after I had officially stopped teaching, and I was very friendly with Ann Blattner. And she used to call me to come and sub at Bicultural. And I liked that very much too. And after she passed away, I stopped going. And by that time, Al and I were traveling, and I wasn't as available, nor was I as needy. I didn't need to be in the school atmosphere as much as I did initially. So, that's sort of about my...
Did you ever encounter any anti-Semitism when you were teaching?
Not in school, no.
Not in the school?
Al never did either. I mean, we were aware because we would hear some, but no. When you're 20 years in a school, you get to know people very well, and I was never in a school where there were not any Jewish teachers. And they weren't particularly my buddies, but I knew them. And the kids in those days, if there was anti-Semitism among the children, which I assume that there was, they were very subtle about it. They didn't call names, or if they did, it was maybe out on the playground, and I was never out there. That wasn't my place. I would say we were very fortunate in those years. And then, as I say again, remember it was wartime. And that particular war, I'm sure you remember, I don't know about that young one over there, brought the country very much together. If you remember, everybody was in the war, whether you really went or not. And we supported it. And people fought together, Jews and Gentiles, and maybe had no relationship ever in their lives prior to that. And I personally didn't have any problem with that.
Was Al in the service?
Pardon?
Was Al in the service?
Al was not in the service, but he was in a special, he was turned down, he had some ear problems, and they weren't taking people. He had, you don't even hear about it anymore. What's the ear condition that all the kids had in those days?
Bastards.
Right. And on that basis, he was not accepted. However, right after the war ended, it became quite apparent, not so shocking today, but it was shocking then, that there had been a lot of theft in the, what did they call where the guys would go and buy cigarettes and...
Candy stores?
What did they call it in the war?
PX.
It became apparent that there had been a lot of stealing going on in the PX. It's all over. And the government gathered together, I don't know how many, a couple of hundred people with business backgrounds. And at that point, Al had been head of the Stanford High School business department for all the years that he was teaching. So he was recruited. I guess, I can't remember now the exact details. I think in the mail he received information. I think that was how they got the men. they sent out letters stating that they were setting up groups to investigate the books. And it was a year overseas with a lieutenant's rank. And it sounded exciting to him, and the pay was pretty good, and he was going to be Lieutenant Scher, and he had always felt very upset about the fact. I think I was very happy, but he had felt terrible that he wasn't in the service. So he said, of course we discussed it, and he said a year's not that long, and I said fine, yeah, it's an important thing to be done, and this is what you want to do, and I'll go back and live with my mother and father. So that was his. And then, by then also, he was head of the business department, but he also had part-time counseling for returning soldiers that would come up to the high school for the service. And he also worked at night school for many, many years for Sally Smith, and he as a counselor. So he had a lot of know-how to bring to this job. And it turned out, you know, he traveled all over Europe and the whole bit. And he was gone for a year, and it was a long year. So that was the extent of his service career. Yes? Anything else about him?
What Jewish organizations, or what organizations were you involved in within Stanford?
Hadassah, National Council of Jewish Women. I always belonged to the center, and I was always in all their plays. Some of them I directed, some of them I was just in. And Edith Lehman and I were very close friends. As a matter of fact, the Lehmans lived across the street from us for a long time. And she also loved to act. And we were in everything. What else did I belong to? I don't know. So many things that I've forgotten that I thought I would never forget.
When were your children born?
Well, my daughter is now 56, and my son is now 51.
And where are they?
Where are they? Janet lives in Massachusetts, and also married a young man that she met when she was very young. I think she was not quite 16. And he had just gotten a license. They met at some New Year's Eve party in Massachusetts. And that was it, too. They were married right after they graduated from college. And so she lives there now. And he's an accountant and has a very large firm that his father started and he inherited and expanded. And Janet, who didn't want to be a teacher either, ended up not only as a teacher but a social studies teacher, and is now a counselor in middle school and has been a counselor for a number of years. So she lives there. She has 2 children. Neither of them married. Her daughter's early 20s and her son is not quite 30. And he's in finance, and the daughter is in fashion. She works for that magazine down there, Marie Claire. And
Your son?
my son has lived, you name it, everywhere. 13 years he lived in Israel, and that really has become the focus of his life. Married to a doctor. He himself is an Orthodox rabbi. My son, an Orthodox rabbi. and got his
Shmicha.
in Israel. And he is not only that, he's an EMS, and he also flies on schedule with an airplane crew. He's part of the group that picks up people all over the country who need emergency flight to go to a special hospital, wherever, you know, it may be. Well, he does that, and he's an EMS with a fire department group where he lives. And he did have a congregation for a couple of years in, of all places, here I go, in Canada. Can't think of the name of the community where he lived. You both know it, but I just can't.
Montreal, Quebec.
No, he wasn't. He was in. Maybe it'll come to me before. Anyway, he had a congregation for I think 3 years, and when he was living in Israel, he was married there to a young American girl who had just graduated from college. No, had just graduated from high school and was enrolled in UCLA as a medical, what's the word, medical student. And her stepfather treated her and a cousin of hers to a trip to Israel as a graduation gift. And Mark at that time was, he was already in rabbinical school, and he did all kinds of odd jobs to earn money. And one of the things that he had become, and was not unusual in Israel at the time, he became a guard with a gun to take people to the wall, to take them on various sightseeing trips so that there would be somebody with a gun. He wasn't always necessarily the guide, though. When he took bus trips, he was the guide on the bus wherever it was they were heading for. So one of the people that was on this bus that he was assigned to on that particular day was this young American girl who was on this trip with her cousin as a graduation gift. She's the mother of 2 children who are over there on the picture. Anyway, and happened to be an exceptionally beautiful girl. She looked like Grace Kelly. You looked at her and you thought, gee, Grace Kelly. There's not a picture of her over there. A picture of her kids are there. A couple of pictures of her kids. But they have been divorced for a number of years now, so her picture isn't there. We're still very friendly. I talk to her periodically. Kids come to visit all the time. And I worked very hard on keeping that relationship going. The whole divorce thing, which I will not get into, was very upsetting to everyone. The little girls were, well, they were 2 and 4 when the household broke up and he left the household. And they were living in Texas at the time, and he was teaching Judaica in a school like our bicultural school here. He lived in Houston with her and the 2 little girls they were both Sabras, but they came here when they were, anyway, I never did find out why they were divorced, Al said if he wants to tell us, he will, and if he doesn't, we won't know, and that's the way that went. But I felt I was the grandmother. These were my grandchildren. I had to keep in touch with her, so I did, and it's worked out very well. So, what did you ask me that started me on this?
Just where Mark was living.
Oh, where Mark was living. So he lived in Israel for 13 years, married to this girl and had these 2 children. And when he finished his rabbinical study and he was ordained, that whole class of men were in a first-time program for rabbis in that, and I remember Rabbi Ehrenkrantz was talking to me one day about it. He said it was a wonderful program, very ambitious program, and it had been very successful. Whether they ever continued it, I don't know. But these men graduated as rabbis and as teachers, but they taught Judaica. And part of it was that when they became rabbis, they had to leave Israel and go back to the United States to, or whatever their country of language was, you know, where they came from, Spain or wherever they came from. And they had to teach Judaica for, I think it was 3 years. And because they felt these were very well-trained teachers and they wanted to get them out in the community teaching the way it should be. And he loved it. He loved being a rabbi. He didn't love the rabbinical part of being, he liked the teaching part of being a rabbi. And he said he didn't spend all those years becoming a rabbi to have to raise money for a community. He wanted to be hands-on with the kids. He wanted to be hands-on with adults. And that's what he and his wife have done. They keep a strictly kosher house in New Mexico. And it's very hard to find a kosher meal in New Mexico. But the word is out and about that if you are traveling and you need a kosher meal and you're in, he lives in
Albuquerque? Santa Fe?
Santa Fe, thank you. What would I do without you? The word is out that you go to Rabbi Scher's house and no questions asked. All you have to do is say, I'm a Jew, and my wife and I, or my wife and my 10 kids and I need a meal. And they always have a refrigerator full of food because they never know if they're going to have a Shabbat meal for themselves alone, a Shabbat meal for one other person, or if they're going to have 10 people walk in on them. And my daughter-in-law, who I adore, lovely, wonderful woman, that's been a marvelous marriage, is an excellent cook, loves to cook in addition to being a doctor, and always has this refrigerator full, full, full. She never knows who's coming. So he, in addition to helping her with all of that, he teaches all kinds of classes. If there's a group of men who want to study Torah, they contact him, they set up, you know, we'll meet you every Wednesday, every whenever. So he's very much hands-on community. And again, he can be called at any time. And I remember Al asking him once, who pays you for this? He says, nobody. He said, what do you mean? He said, I don't get paid. He said, if a class wants to pay me at the end of a session, you know, we've done whatever and they'll give me a check. Or if they give me nothing, he said, I never ask. You want a class? We'll have a class. So he does that in addition to being now a registered nurse, and he's always on the move, always on the go. And they talk about going back to Israel constantly. I hope I'm not around anymore when that happens, because 13 years of having children in Israel, let me tell you, is a long time. And I was much younger then. I couldn't do it now. I haven't told him that. And even if I told him, it's his life, and her life. And this is what they plan to do. But I'm going to be 87 in September, so I don't think that I'm going to be around by the time she decides to retire, and he decides to retire. So I don't think I'll know what that's all about. But it's been a very interesting life for him. He knows people from everywhere. Keeps in touch with Israel constantly. I think every day he talks. When he wants to know what's going on in Israel, he calls up a friend and says, "Read me what it says," and all still speaks Hebrew all the time, as well as English. And anything you read something in the paper and it doesn't sound kosher to you, I'll give you his phone number. You call him up and he'll tell you the emes of what it really is. So that takes care of my son and my daughter. My daughter's thinking of retiring in 3-4 years. And Mark, I will just go on forever. I don't think he'll ever retire. And if he does, he'll be back in Israel.
Well, Ellie, I want to thank you. This has been an interesting interviewing you.
Very, very welcome.
And you will be part of the Jewish Community Archives.
Well, that was a fun thing too. I love being active. I'm no longer active in the community of the Jewish Historical Society the way I was at the beginning. But I certainly think of it with fondness. I made good friends that I still see. And it was wonderful. Anybody want more water?
Nope.
This little girl.
It's your daughter's.
And there she is again, a little older, and this is my grandson. I have just one grandson, and it belongs to my daughter, who also owns that child. And this is one of Mark's, my son's. This is his younger daughter.
Do you have a picture of Mark?
Yes, I do.
Who's the boy next to the girl on the end?
Where?
This one.
This one? This one is this one. They're just different ages. And this is Safta with two of her 3 granddaughters. This is, as I say, here's my daughter and her husband, and this girl is that girl, and this boy is this boy, and this girl is this girl, and this is Al and I, and Mark when he was little, and Janet. Mark doesn't look much like that now. He's gray-haired. He's getting bald, like Daddy was. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were doing that.
Okay, well, I thank you very much. It's great.
Okay.
Janet and David and Jeff, and this is the one who works for the fashion magazine, and this is Janet, and this one, and David, and that one. These are Mark's kids. She looks very much like her mother. It's just a little girl here, tall and very beautiful. I have to say, very beautiful. Now, you step over here. The top of that picture is Mark in uniform in Israel. I don't have any recent pictures of him. He never likes to take them, and they, you know, he's a big computer person, and he's got all kinds of equipment for everything.